For 5 days, a NATO exercise asked a question no one wanted answered. What happens when a conventional war turns nuclear? In November 1983, A.Y. Bull Archer, 83, rehearsed NATO's nuclear release procedures during one of the most anxious moments of the Cold War. In Moscow, Soviet leaders and intelligence officers watched for signs that the exercise might hide a real first strike. If you were in their place, would you trust that the messages were only practice, or would you prepare for the worst? The danger was not a button already being pressed. It was miscalculation, fear interpreting a drill as the opening move of war. A.Y. Bull Archer, 83, was the nuclear release climax of a larger NATO exercise cycle. From November 7 to 11, headquarters practiced how commands would move from conventional war planning towards simulated nuclear authorization. Exercise used more realistic procedures and message formats than earlier versions, including communications that moved forces through alert phases on paper. That made it useful training for NATO, but dangerous theater for Soviet observers. Drill took place after the KAL-7 shootdown, before NATO's planned Pershing II deployments, and amid the language of the evil empire and Operation RYN. It was a simulation, entering a political atmosphere already wired for panic. Yuri Andropov did not need to invent his fear from nothing. The KGB had been running Operation RYN, a collection effort meant to detect signs of a Western surprise nuclear attack. Soviet intelligence posts were asked to watch bases, communications, political movements, and anything that might reveal a countdown. Andropov was seriously ill. Soviet command politics were tense, and the Kremlin already believed the West might exploit a period of vulnerability. So when A.Y. Bull Archer produced realistic traffic, Moscow did not see a harmless classroom exercise. It saw one more pattern in a year full of warnings.
NATO's nuclear release procedure was designed to move through controlled, authenticated steps, not a single push-button moment. During A.Y. Bull Archer, headquarters practiced parts of that chain: warnings, consultations, formatted messages, and simulated requests for higher authorization. The exercise was training, but its realism mattered. Paper forms, voice channels, and alert language could look ominous to an adversary already searching for signs of deception. To Soviet observers, the most dangerous detail was not chaos, it was order. A real escalation might also look like routine messages moving cleanly through a system. Somewhere in that routine, the line between drill and reality could appear thinner than NATO intended. In Moscow, Operation Ryan turned fear into a checklist. KGB and GRU residencies were told to report signs of increased alert at American and NATO bases. Warsaw Pact intelligence services concentrated on the exercise. Soviet and Allied collection units watched the air and radio traffic around Europe. Some forward-based Soviet air forces moved to unusual readiness. There were reports of nuclear weapons being moved from storage to delivery units, flight stand-downs, and aircraft kept ready. None of this proved the Soviets were about to launch, but it proved they were not ignoring the exercise. They were measuring it against a nightmare they already believed possible. General Leonard Peretz, the U.S. Air Force intelligence chief in Europe, was watching the other side from Ramstein Air Base in West Germany. During the scare, reporting suggested unusual Soviet readiness measures, aircraft activity, alert changes, and other signals that could be read in more than one way. Peretz had a choice. He could recommend a matching Western response or hold back and avoid feeding the cycle. He chose restraint. Later reviews treated that choice as important because it was not simply a line in a manual. It was judgment under uncertainty. Across the wire, Soviet commanders were also watching for signs that NATO was moving from exercise to attack. Nothing obvious came. Sometimes restraint is not dramatic. It is a silence that prevents another silence from becoming war. The danger was not a single flashing screen. It was a chain of people reading signs under pressure. NATO officers rehearsed release messages. Soviet officers tried to decide whether those messages were still inside the exercise. Intelligence reports arrived late, incomplete, and stripped of context. In one headquarters, a normal training step could look routine. In another, the same step could look like the final mask before an attack. No computer could solve that. The system depended on commanders recognizing the difference between preparation and performance, while both sides were deliberately hiding parts of what they were doing. There were no machines to blame. Every step depended on people who could say yes, no, or wait. In Washington, in NATO headquarters, and in Moscow, officials were reading fragments of the same crisis through different fears. Andropov's health was failing, but Soviet suspicion of Western attack was not imaginary to those inside the system. Between the leaders stood dozens of officers, analysts, translators, radio operators, and aides. Any one of them could misread a report or pass along a warning stripped of context. In that haze, even routine traffic could feel threatening. The danger was not that one nervous person controlled the world. It was that many careful people, each protecting their side, could still build a chain no one meant to complete. There was no confirmed moment when Soviet leaders held a launch order over a table and chose not to sign. The records are more unsettling because they are less cinematic. By November 11, Able Archer ended, and the unusual Soviet alert began to subside. Flight training returned. The exercise did not become war, but later reviews concluded that at least some Soviet forces may have been preparing either to preempt a NATO strike or to preserve a minimum ability to retaliate. That is the danger, not a villain making a speech, but institutions moving closer to war because each side thinks the other side may already be moving. Later, Western analysts argued over how close AY Bull Archer came to disaster. Some early intelligence assessments downplayed the danger. The later PFIAB review, written with access to a wider record, was much more alarmed. It found that Soviet fears were genuine, and that the United States may have put the relationship on a hair trigger without realizing it. The readiness measures were real enough to matter. Unusual air alerts, intelligence mobilization, and preparations that could have been read as preemption or retaliation. The truth is not that missiles were seconds from launch. It is that neither side fully understood how frightened the other had become. For those who made the calls, the cost did not end when the drill did. Andropov died 3 months later, after a year in which Soviet leaders had seen threats everywhere. In the West, Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz was later singled out because he did not answer unusual Soviet activity with a matching Western escalation. The PFIAB report called that restraint correct, but also fortuitous because it came from instinct rather than clear guidance. That is a hard sentence to live with. The world may have depended less on a perfect system than on one officer deciding not to make the system louder. A Bull Archer 83 changed how leaders thought about exercises. The lesson was not that NATO should never train for nuclear release. It was that realism has a diplomatic cost when the other side is primed to see deception. Reagan later reacted strongly to evidence that Soviet fear had been real, and his diary shows him worrying that Soviet leaders were genuinely paranoid about attack. The exercise became a warning about opacity. If an adversary believes you might use a drill as cover, every realistic message can become evidence. Every silence can become confirmation, and every routine procedure can become a signal no one meant to send. Here is what the archives hold. AY Bull Archer 83 ran in early November 1983 and practiced NATO nuclear release procedures. Soviet intelligence had warnings that the exercise was coming, but Moscow still ordered collection against signs of a Western attack. On November 8 or 9, KGB residencies in Western Europe were told to report on increased alert at American bases. Warsaw Pact collection intensified. Some Soviet air forces moved into unusual readiness. By November 11, the alert receded. No missile launched, no city burned. The record preserves movements, messages, and warnings. It also preserves how easy it was to misunderstand them. Command is not just a matter of issuing orders. It is the burden of knowing that a word can erase cities or save them. In November 1983, the men at the top did not trust what they saw, and they did not fully understand what the other side saw. For Andropov, for Rogers, for Perutz, and for the unnamed officers on both sides, the weight was strategic and personal. They could not know in real time whether caution was wisdom or weakness. They only knew that one misread signal could turn a rehearsal into history's last mistake. The world did not end in November 1983. No missiles flew, and no city burned. That does not mean the danger was imaginary. The later record suggests the line between exercise and perceived threat was thinner than Western leaders understood at the time. Some people waited. Some doubted. Some chose not to answer uncertainty with louder signals of their own. They may never be remembered with parades or statues, but their restraint mattered. Since then, military exercises and nuclear signaling have carried the memory of such scares. Warnings double-checked, channels watched, assumptions questioned. The future still hangs on moments like that, not only on bold commands, but on the discipline to avoid moving first when fear says that waiting is weakness. For 5 days, the world moved through a rehearsal that some in Moscow feared might be more than rehearsal. If it were you, sitting in that chain of command, staring at alerts and coded messages, would you have trusted the exercise label, or would you have moved first, afraid that waiting meant dying second? The men of Able Archer did not know they were inside a future warning to the world. Their choices were made in uncertainty, with no applause and no clean proof. That is why the story matters. Nuclear danger often arrives not as madness, but as caution misread by another cautious man.